Today, some of the flood outreach that's going on the stop signs and on the signs throughout town. So I see that there is some awareness. In mountain environments, we do have elevated risk for flash flooding, but that increases when we have these fire events. And that flood threat is active for several years after fire. So in these situations, it's really best that you protect yourself. So in an event of a flood, the best way to prepare is, to have a plan. Ways that you can prepare yourself is by, seeing or watching the news. If you have a NOAA weather radio, so you know that there's flood coming, as well as signing up for local alerts or knowing where you can get that information at the local level, so that in the case that you have to evacuate. Something that we see every year is that about 50% of fatalities in a flood event are caused in cars. So if there is a flood event, be sure to turn around, don't drown. You want to stay away from that flood water and get to higher ground. About 6 inches of water can sweep you off your feet, and about a foot of water can sweep away a car. So it's really important to know that. Too. Having a kit is also really important so that you know where your belongings are when you're ready to go. So things like important documents, your social security card, your insurance policy information, as well as things like your birth certificate, special medications, eyeglasses. Having all of that before a flood is really important so that you're ready to go in the case of a disaster. Also, if you have pets, it's really important to have a plan so that you know where they're going. A lot of times, if you have to go to a shelter, they won't take pets, and people will end up not going or leaving their pets behind, and that's a big thing that we see in disasters. Also, you can elevate your possessions ahead of time, so valuables or heirloom, things like photographs, you can do that ahead of time, and those are things to start to think about now before a flood. And when you're putting a kit together, you can do it in a backpack so that if you have children, your hands are free and you have that kit ready and you're able to grab other things as you go. But what you might all be really here for is to know more about the flood insurance aspect and that way of preparing yourself. So I'm going to turn this over now to Matt Buddy with FEMA, and he'll give you more insight on ways to get flood insurance and what to know.
Thank you, Stephanie. Good evening, everyone. Good. A colleague of mine, his name's Andy, is an insurance actuary. And if you don't know what an insurance actuary is, these are incredibly smart people that crunch numbers all day. I don't think it comes as any surprise that when our children turn 16 and start driving, your insurance premium goes up quite a bit. The actuaries are the ones that are crunching those numbers to realize how much to increase premiums. And my colleague Andy, his son, who's 4 years old, last year really wanted to be an insurance actuary for his Halloween costume. So his dad went out and got him the pants and the shirt and the tie and a clipboard. And what he did is he printed off the life expectancies for, depending on age, sex, race, all the different criteria, and put it on the clipboard and sent his son out to go trick-or-treating. And he goes up to the first door and he rings the doorbell, and a nice old man comes to the door and says, "Trick-or-treat." And he says, "Oh, what are you supposed to be?" And he says, "I'm an insurance actuary. Do you want to know when you're going to die?" And the man said, "No." So my colleague Andy worked on the messaging a little bit, but this was repeated throughout the night on Halloween. And does anyone want to take a guess how many people said, "Yes, I want to know when I'm going to die"? 0. No one wanted to know. And I think it really speaks to when we know what our risk is, I think there is this compulsion to take action, to do something about that. And this example that I give, which is a true story, maybe it's changing diet. I know I need to be exercising more, or I need to eat healthier, or make some lifestyle changes. And when you know, then you don't have an excuse. And as Stephanie mentioned, the flood risk has changed because of the burn scar. With most disasters, you have this very definitive beginning date and a very definitive end date. With wildfire, it's the disaster that keeps on giving for multiple years. It's very difficult to separate this flood after fire phenomenon. It doesn't take a lot of rain, up to a quarter inch of rain that would normally soak into the ground now becomes runoff and goes right into the drainage. One of the best things that you can do to protect yourself is to buy flood insurance and insure your property. It doesn't take a lot of water to cause a lot of damage. We've been throwing this statistic out for quite some time now. 1 inch of water can cause up to $25,000 worth of damage. But when you start putting in high velocity flows and debris and mud and everything else that's going to come off that burn scar, that's going to cause a lot of damage, especially with the velocity and the force that water is going to be coming down through that drainage. So tonight I'm going to be talking about flood insurance through the National Flood Insurance Program, which is administered by the Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA. I may refer to it, I think I have a slide that says NFIP, that stands for National Flood Insurance Program. At FEMA, which is an acronym in and of itself, we like our acronyms. We have an entire book of acronyms. So I will try to limit that because sometimes I get a lot of blank stares of, what are you talking about? Speak in English, please. I will say that flood insurance through the NFIP is not the only flood insurance that's available. There is a growing private market, and I don't know all of the specifics because each one of those companies writes the policies, and they're all a little bit different. So just understand that we want people to be insured because we know that people with insurance recover faster and more fully. So I'm going to talk about NFIP because that's what I know, but understand that it's not the only opportunity in town. Really, anyone that lives in a participating community can buy a policy. A lot of times, one of the biggest myths and misconceptions that we have, people think, I live in a floodplain, I can't buy flood insurance. And then we have a whole other set of people that think, well, I don't live in a floodplain, so I can't buy flood insurance. The reality is anyone who lives in a participating community, whether you're in the floodplain or the high-risk area or outside of that, can purchase flood insurance. I have a list here of all of the participating communities in Huerfano and Castilla County. Blanca is the only community that we showed that does not participate. So if you live within the jurisdictional boundaries of Blanca, flood insurance through the NFIP is not available. But anywhere else, you can purchase a policy. Okay, so I don't want to make assumptions because I know you guys are very proactive, good folks here, but I know me personally, when I get my insurance policy, when I get the declaration page, I usually just file that guy right away without reading it. And I will say most people file that away without reading it until they need to file a claim. And that's not always the best time to know what your coverage is. So one of the things that I would ask you to do is review your existing policy that you have, your homeowner's policy. I'm willing to bet that every single one of you in here have a policy that specifically excludes flood. This is another misconception or myth that we hear a lot. People, after a flooding event, they say, I thought I had coverage. I have a homeowner's policy, or I have a renter's policy. Flood is specifically excluded. And I won't read you the list of all the other perils here that are mostly excluded from most policies, but there are things that are not covered under a homeowner's policy. One other thing that you can do right now, and this is just good practice regardless, is to take pictures of all of your possessions. Or, we all have these phones, right, that are basically supercomputers that have a camera on them. Take a picture or a video of all of your possessions. This is really going to help you in the event of a claim, that you have documentation that you actually owned what you're putting in a claim for. Again, I will use myself as an example. I tend to procrastinate sometimes. I typically push the deadline as far as I can to turn in that report or get that project done. I did not take pictures or video of my stuff until the spring of 2015. We had a very, very wet spring. I live up in Lakewood, and I had probably about 6 inches of water in my basement. As Stephanie mentioned, elevating important things that can't be replaced. I hear this, take care of yourself. Things can be replaced. Well, some things can't be replaced. Baby pictures. I think the younger generations, everything's going to be up in the cloud, but I know I have a lot of very important pictures and things that just cannot be replaced. I had a whole crate of baby pictures in my basement, and luckily the water was moving in that direction, and I was able to get it out before they got wet. But after that, I went around. It took me probably less than 10 minutes to take a picture of every room and my possessions, like my TV, my computer, and things like that. So that's something that you could do this weekend. You don't have to wait. So there's a lot of text on here, and I apologize. Let me just highlight a few things. This actually comes from the flood insurance policy. The flood insurance policy is a contract. All insurance is a contract. In order to file a claim and have that claim be paid out, you have to meet certain parameters, certain criteria. This is the definition of a flood. This is what has to happen in order to be triggered for you to file a claim if you have a policy. And again, I won't read it all, but I've kind of highlighted the key text here. 2 or more acres of normally dry land, or 2 or more properties. So, if we're here in town in Walsenburg, and there's 2 properties, one of which is insured, and the other property could be the street, could be the sidewalk, or something that the city owns, as long as you don't own it, and that has water on it that is normally dry, you can file a claim. The other thing here that I want to point out on the last bullet, surface water. Very important. Flood insurance through the National Flood Insurance Program does not cover subsurface water or seepage. That's excluded from the policy. But notice, from any source. You don't have to live next to the river and have it come out of its banks. It could be from a rapid snowmelt. It could be from a locally intense rain event. It can be from a burn scar. Water from any source is covered as long as it's surface water and it's impacting 2 or more properties, or if you live out in the county where maybe the next property is a half mile down the road, we'll substitute 2 acres for the 2 properties. The other important thing is it covers mud flow. And that's really probably what our biggest concern in this area is the policy does cover mud flow. Now, what is mud flow? Again, we have a very specific definition for this in the policy in order for it to cover mud flow. a river of liquid and flowing mud on the surface of normally dry land, dry area, where the earth is carried by water. Okay? Landslide, slope failure, and other types of earth movement are not covered under a flood policy. So you can see here, this is actually, I believe, US 24, going from Colorado Springs up to Woodland Park after the Waldo Canyon fire. And I'm hoping that this plays. I think we turned the volume down. Oh, hold on. We're going to, just so you can get an idea of what I'm talking about when I say mud flow. And notice the only thing protecting this gentleman is this wall that could give way at any point. So I do not advise you taking pictures if this happens in Walsenburg or in this community. So we had a meeting yesterday in Canyon City for the folks down from the Hayden Pass burn scar, and they actually had a flood event, I believe it was last year, and had very, very similar video to this. This stuff happens very, very quickly, and the time to practice a plan or to make these preparations is now. This is a landslide, okay? If a landslide, even if it's caused by a lot of soil saturation, causes the slope failure or the earth movement, and this is obviously a very extreme photograph, but you can have a lot smaller land subsidences. This is not covered under a flood policy. You do have to meet that definition of a flood. Okay, so flood insurance covers direct physical damage from flood. When you buy flood insurance through the National Flood Insurance Program, you can either buy building coverage, you can buy contents coverage if you're just a renter, or you can buy building and contents. And some of the policies, depending how they're packaged, may have them both packaged together, building and contents. One thing to note, flood insurance covers property inside the dwelling if you have contents coverage. It doesn't cover landscaping, swimming pools, gazebos, fencing. It has to be inside the structure in order for it to be covered in the event of a claim. So for a residential structure, the maximum amount of coverage you can buy on the building is $250,000. For contents, you can buy up to $100,000. For a non-residential or commercial property, you can buy $500,000 on building and $500,000 on the contents. And you know, I will say, as we walked around town here this afternoon and looked at all of the different signs with the different levels on them, which I think is an amazing awareness campaign, and really applaud you, the community, for doing that, because it brings it front and center. You know, I can tell you over 50% of businesses do not reopen after a flooding event. So it's very critical for businesses to have that coverage as well. So there is limited basement coverage on flood insurance through the NFIP. We define a basement as any area that's subgrade on all sides. The things that are not covered in a basement are things like contents. You know, when you buy a new TV, what do you do with the old one? It still works. You put it in the basement, right? Or some people have very elaborate, you know, entertainment systems in areas and PlayStations and things like that. That stuff is not going to be covered. I want to tell you what is going to be covered. Anything that's mechanically required to run the upstairs, so furnace, hot water tank, oil tanks, electrical panels, all of that stuff is covered. If there's, again, you have to meet the definition of a flood. If there's issues with the foundation, that will be covered. The other big thing that's covered is debris removal. So all that mud and the muck that I was talking about, that would be under the policy would be eligible to be reimbursed. If you did have a finished basement, it would pay to cut out drywall and things like that that got damaged, and it would actually even pay to replace it, but it wouldn't be finished. So no taping, no mudding, no painting, no wallpaper or any sort of finish on that wall, no carpeting. Basically, the policy will give you back a clean, unfinished basement. If you have a contents policy or contents coverage, it does also cover the washer, the dryer, the freezer, and the food in the freezer. And we do have a brochure out on the table that's called Summary of Coverage, and that has kind of lists everything that's covered and not covered and really goes into that basement coverage that I talked about. Yes. The question is, and if you guys have questions, I think we're a small enough group. Let's maybe stop and ask them if that's okay with everyone. But the question was, would mechanical equipment in a crawl space be covered? And yes, it would be, as long as it's within that footprint of the building. Increased cost of compliance. This is also something that's under every policy. So let's say you have a damage, you have a claim, and you go to the city or the county to get a permit to rebuild, and the city says, well, your house was built in the 1940s before we had any sort of risk information. You're now required to elevate above the flood zone area. There is an extra $30,000 that's built into the flood policy that will pay to mitigate future flood risk. It'll actually pay to flood-proof, to relocate, or elevate, or actually demolish a structure if you're looking to go, maybe rebuild on another section of the property or in another area of town. It'll actually pay to demolish the existing structure. So that's something that's built into every policy, and it's up to $30,000. So I heard recently a saying that goes, by the time you hear the thunder, it's too late to build the ark. And the same thing is true for flood insurance, because there's a 30-day wait from the time that you pay your insurance agent the premium until that policy goes effective. There's a 30-day wait. The reason for this is because when the National Flood Insurance Program was created 50 years ago, it was designed in order to be solvent. So if we were paying out $100,000 to you, we would have to be taking $100,000 over here in premiums, and understanding that this year is your year to turn in a claim, and at some point this person is going to turn in a claim, and this is what the actuaries kind of crunch in their spreadsheets to determine risks and rates and things like that. And we decided that 30 days was far enough out that people wouldn't buy this just because they watched the Weather Channel and knew that the thunderstorm was going to be coming, or it was going to be some sort of claim that was going to be turned in. So it's important that if you are going to consider purchasing flood insurance, that you talk to an agent soon, because spring runoff's coming, summer thunderstorms are coming, and we don't want people to be in a situation where they've paid a premium and the policy is not yet effective. I really like this one because I've been doing this for over a decade now, and one of the things that I hear quite frequently is, FEMA, your maps are wrong, or there's this misunderstanding of why maps are changing, or why we come out and we do new flood studies. The reality is risk changes. It's not static. It's very dynamic. There's a lot of different factors that change how we depict flood risk. We have much better modeling techniques. We can gather much more accurate topographic information. We have a longer period of record when we're looking at rainfall and events to determine what are the likelihood that a type of event will occur. The other thing that changes flood risk is development upstream in the watershed. All of that stuff can change where water goes and how it's going to react during a flooding event. So we try to stay on top of that, and we work very closely with Stephanie and the Colorado Water Conservation Board to remap areas. But the thing that I want to mention here is we are not actively in the process of remapping any of the areas here as a result of the Spring Creek fire. So even though we know the flood risk has gone up because of the burn scar, we are not changing the maps because we know in 5 to 7, maybe 10 years, that risk is going to come back to some sort of condition as what it was pre-fire. So the insurance rates for flood insurance through the National Flood Insurance Program are based on flood insurance rate maps that are not changing. So you may be in a low-risk area, you know your risk has actually gone up because of the burn scar, but your rate is not going to reflect that higher risk. Now I know that everyone has a lot of different things that you could spend your money on, and I'm here to try to encourage you to consider flood insurance. And as a parent who I understand that. So I want to talk a little bit about the rates. If you do not live in that high-risk area that's on the FEMA flood insurance rate map, you can get a preferred risk policy. A renter's only policy through a preferred risk policy is, I believe, about $130 a year. This is one where it actually, you can package building and contents. You can get a good policy for about $325 a year. Now, it's very difficult to say what a rate will be because it depends on, are you buying the maximum amount of coverage, $250,000 for a residential structure? Are you buying $100,000? Are you buying $20,000? That whole spectrum can change the rate. And I'm going to jump down here to the middle bullet. We also can vary the deductible. So if you get a $10,000 deductible, obviously that rate's going to be much lower than, let's say, a $1,000 deductible. So understand that there are ways to make it more affordable, either by, maybe you don't need the full $250,000 worth of coverage, and maybe you can take a higher deductible and still have the coverage. Now, if you live in a high-risk area, it's designated on the flood insurance rate map. Again, there are a lot of different variables that go into the rating of that, depending on when the structure was built, the year of construction, the type of foundation. There are what flood zone it's in, what elevation it's at. All of that stuff will affect the rate. But I did look, and the average rate in Colorado is about $800 a year in that high-risk area. Now, since FEMA administers the National Flood Insurance Program, we set the rates. We come out with a rating manual twice a year, once in April and once in October. And so rates do not change from agent to agent. So you're probably asking, well, Matt, where do I buy flood insurance? I'm somewhat interested. I want to find out some more information. How do I get a hold of you, or how do I get a hold of someone at FEMA to talk more about this? We actually work with, I believe it's 68 different insurance companies through a program where they write and service the policy on behalf of FEMA. It's all backed. You know, the agent that you use for your auto or your homeowners or your life insurance, you have a relationship with that individual already. So FEMA decided, hey, let's try to make this easy for folks so they can go with people that they already know, as opposed to, how do I get a hold of FEMA? I'll tell you, sometimes back in the day, we had terrible customer service, and we didn't do a good job of servicing the program when we used to try to sell it direct. You can get it directly through FEMA, but I would encourage you, any insurance agent that's licensed to sell property or casualty insurance in the state of Colorado can write flood. If they're not available to do that, typically they have folks in their company, in their underwriting department, that will write flood. So the first place would be to check with your insurance agent, and those rates do not vary from agent to agent. I mentioned the deductible. We also take cash, credit, or check for the premium. And as Larry mentioned, with flood insurance, there's no federal declaration that's needed in order to file a claim. The only thing you need is surface water, 2 pieces of property or 2 acres, water from any source, and you can file a claim. The average grant through disaster declaration in a post-disaster setting is about $5,000. I think the max is $31,000 or $32,000. That is not going to, $5,000 is not going to get you very far when you're trying to rebuild a house or a business and pay for your possessions and your contents. This is another misconception. People think, why do I need flood insurance? FEMA's going to come in and help provide assistance. And that does happen on a very limited basis, but not every disaster rises to the elevation of a presidential disaster declaration. There's a different criteria that has to be met, and there's a formal process that has to overwhelm state or local resources and overwhelm state resources, and the governor has to make a request. So just understand, not every disaster will be a presidentially declared disaster. I keep pointing here, and I'm wondering, why does it not advance? I need to go this way. I feel like I skipped a slide. Okay. Real quickly, I want to talk about claims. So if you buy a policy and you have a flooding event, if you're unsure whether it qualifies or meets the definition of a flood, call your agent right away. That's the number one thing. The second thing that you can do is, as soon as it's safe and the local officials have said you can go back, start taking pictures. Again, we all have phones, and take pictures, take video. Anything that helps with that documentation process is going to help assist you through that claims journey. There is also an appeal process. And I was talking to someone last year who was downstream, down from a burn scar, and they had a half-inch rain event and had a debris flow, and it was classified by the United States Geological Survey and the National Weather Service as a debris flow. And they called their agent, they sent a claims adjuster out, and the claims adjuster said that you're not covered. Everything this person described to me, I came to the conclusion that this was indeed a mud flow and should have been covered by the policy. Unfortunately, this conversation happened a year later, and there was no mechanism for them to go back and reopen the claim. The claim had been closed because the claims adjuster said you're not covered. So I guess I wanted to make sure that I pointed out that there is an appeal process, and it has to be filed within 60 days of the denial letter from the company. Again, because there's a bunch of different insurance companies that service the policy. They use their claims adjusters to go out and do the adjustment process. All the appeals come directly to FEMA, and that's when we get involved and we look at all of the details. So understand there is a claims process. There is this publication, I think that's 687, but I'm sure if you typed, did a search for NFIP claims, you could get this claims handbook, or if you could get it from your insurance agent. And this really goes into detail and describes the claims process and some of these timelines and things like that. So the statisticians have calculated, they've looked back at all of the wars and disease, and the fact that your mom and dad met long enough to create you is the odds of that are 1 in 400 billion. If you take nothing else away from this tonight, protect yourself. Make that plan. Know if you're going to evacuate. Know if you're going to stay in place, shelter in place. Know what if you have to evacuate at night? What are you going to do? How are you going to alert your family, your loved ones? Where are you going to go? Do you have pets? All of the stuff that Stephanie mentioned. Practice that plan now. Talk to your family. Talk to your neighbors, folks that couldn't be here tonight. On the next slide, I have a website. It's called ready.gov, and that's a website for FEMA's National Preparedness Program. We have sample checklists that you can print off and take to the store about what you should have in an evacuation kit. We have sample plans and things like that of where to go and things like that. So there's a lot of resources out there. In fact, we were in Serendipity, the coffee shop, and they had a whole bunch of great stuff on their bookshelf there by the window of resources about things that you should have in a plan and things in your kit and things like that. So take care of yourself and take care of one another. And then insure yourself. Review your existing coverage. That's always just a good thing to have in the event that you ever have to file a claim for any reason. Remember that 30-day wait is in place. It's going to be here before we know it. Don't gamble. Don't buy a policy because you want to turn a claim in. Buy it for protection. Buy it for peace of mind. Buy it so you can sleep easy at night, knowing that if there's an event, you don't have to worry about your stuff. You get to worry about your family and getting out and being safe. And then talk to your insurance agent. Oh, I see it. I'm still doing it. In terms of resources, you have a lot of good resources here right at the local level. Your local, the emergency management folks and city staff and county staff. They can tell you with what's going on with warnings and testing sirens and how to be notified, reverse 911. I'm not sure all of the capabilities here, but talk to them. I think there's going to be some sandbags that are going to be available here in the next future. So there's a lot of really good resources that are available at the local level. So know who those folks are. Larry kicked us off, so he's a great resource. I already mentioned talk to your insurance agent. The middle bullet there is actually the National Flood Insurance Program call center. That will get you to a live individual. If you ever have questions, or say you talk to your insurance agent and they say, well, we don't really do that flood stuff, the folks here can get you in contact, and this would be where you could buy insurance direct through FEMA. Again, the price is the same. It would not be more or less. And then I mentioned ready.gov. That's the National Preparedness website with all of the different resources, and they do all hazards, not just flooding, not just fire. They have resources for everything. Floodsmart.gov, that's the website for the National Flood Insurance Program. A good resource, just a lot of information out there about stats and, again, more, where to go, how much it costs, things like that. And then one thing that I didn't mention is the FEMA MAP Service Center is the last website on here, the MSC MAP Service Center. This is the website where you could actually look up a flood insurance rate map and determine what your current level of flood risk is based on the flood study that was done prior to the Spring Creek fire. And I believe, I don't have the dates, I think Levita's map is from 1986 or 89. 86, thank you. And the Walsenburg map is also, 30 years old. So, again, as I mentioned, flood risk changes. There's a lot of different factors that do change that. If it is no longer accurately reflecting the risk, we do have a revision process that you can go through. But as I also mentioned, we are not going to revise that based on the Spring Creek fire because we know that we're in this period of heightened risk, and it should go back to somewhat stable conditions once the area gets revegetated and things like that. So I believe that is my last slide, and I would love to open it up to questions. If anyone has anything, if you don't feel comfortable asking in front of the crowd, certainly we can talk one-on-one afterwards. Yes. So the question was, she's been quoted anywhere from $500 to $5,000, and wants to know which one is legitimate. I would assume that I'm not sure if it was insurance through the National Flood Insurance Program or not, but there could have been different coverage amounts. Maybe someone was quoting you $250,000 and someone else was quoting you $50,000. Could have been different deductibles. Without knowing the exact specifics, it's hard to say. But certainly talking to the agent and understanding exactly what they're quoting you and what the coverage is. Is it through National Flood Insurance Program or is it through some other carrier? Would definitely help kind of clarify why you're getting that, because that is a pretty broad difference in rate. So she said one of them was Lloyd's of London. That is one of the private insurers. That's not National Flood Insurance Program. So I'm not familiar with all of the specifics of those policies. In all of the ins and outs, so it's very important to talk to the agent about that. I would encourage you to go back and ask him to quote through the National Flood Insurance Program, and if he doesn't write that or says no, I don't do that, go call that 1-800 number, and you can get a quote and talk to someone on the call center. Yes, ma'am. So talk to Karen if you'd like more information. Yes, sir.
I'm from Coastie County, and I live along the Sun Creek
So yes, he is in a Zone C, which is a low-risk area according to the FEMA flood insurance rate map, and would definitely want to talk to an agent about a preferred risk policy or PRP policy. That's the one that is about. I think if you max out the coverage of $250,000, I think it's like $525 a year. If you get the max $250 and $100,000 worth of contents, so then it would go down from there, and that's a year for that preferred risk policy. So definitely connect with Karen; she can help you out. Yes, sir.
So one of the risks that people are looking at here in town is if if the flood causes some breaches in our sewer system and we end up with a sewage backup in our system because of the flood in our homes. Is that covered under the flood?
That's a great question, and thanks for bringing it up. The question was, is sewer backup covered under a NFIP flood insurance policy? Maybe. It can be. Typically, no, it's not, unless the sewer backup is a result of a flood as defined by the policy. So what happens is a claims adjuster would come out, and he has to be able to definitively say, yes, this your sewer backup was caused by that flood. He has to establish proximate cause, and that may be a little subjective, but if they can say yes, that surface water covering 2 acres or 2 pieces of property caused your sewer backup, then it would be covered.
So if the resulting sewer line broke 2 miles away, caused by water, which was flooding, pushes the sewage up into everyone's homes, covered or not covered? If I have FEMA.
I'm not sure I would feel comfortable saying that 2 miles away the sewer line breaks.
A mile away,
Yeah, I probably would leave that to. I'm not an expert in the claims, but again, I would say if they establish the proximate cause, saying that flood caused that sewer backup, then it would be covered. But I don't know all of the criteria that they would look at for that.
And just out of interest, you can always put a backflow preventer on your sewer line under your house. Is usually the easiest place to do it. It's less than $100 to do it yourself.
Yeah, that's a relatively easy mitigation technique, is to put in a backflow valve. Also putting in things like floor drains, can help as well. So those are relatively cheap ways to help mitigate risk. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I've had people contact me regarding elevation certificates. Can you discuss why they're being asked for, what are the circumstances under which those are needed, and who is qualified to produce those?
So the question was elevation certificates, who's required to have them, who can do them, why are they required? Right now, elevation certificates are required in order to properly rate a newer home that's in a high-risk area. So when you look at the FEMA flood insurance rate map, if you're a newer home, and so when a community gets their initial flood map from FEMA, we say anything that was built prior to that initial flood map, we call it pre-FIRM, and FIRM stands for Flood Insurance Rate Map. So we say that this house was built before the risk was identified. We are not going to write that policy in such a way that it's going to the premium's going to reflect the true risk rate because it was built before the risk was identified. So if you're 1940s, 1950, 1960, you can actually get a subsidized rate. Anything that's been built after the community's initial flood insurance rate map date, we call post-firm. In order to rate a post-firm structure that is in a high-risk area, it is required to have an elevation certificate. And all that is it's an official FEMA form where a surveyor or engineer would go out and set up their equipment and capture very specific elevations. So you would have the elevation of the lowest floor, the next highest floor, the elevation of machinery and equipment, attached garages, things like that. So it's required in order for an agent to properly rate a post-firm structure. Communities can also require them to show compliance with floodplain regulations. There are a couple other reasons that you would want to do an elevation certificate, but without getting too far into the weeds, I'll just say that it's needed for a newer built structure. So any licensed land surveyor or professional engineer can complete an elevation certificate as long as they're licensed in the state of Colorado. That would be at the expense of the homeowner. Sometimes a community might have one on file, so I always encourage folks, hey, if you're a new owner and the house was built, the community may have required a elevation certificate when it was built. So check with them to see if they have something on file, because the elevations are not going to change. They're still relevant. Yes, sir.
You did mention the sewage. Do the plans cover septic and well?
No, it only covers the structure, things that are inside the structure. So septic and wells would not be covered under a NFIP flood insurance policy. Yes? Debris removal?
Yeah, my problem right now is I am already having to remove debris from the creek out of my culverts. And I've done it about 3 times now since the spring fire. Would that be covered under this kind of policy?
So removing debris from the channel as a mitigation effort, no, that would not be covered under a flood insurance policy. Not clearing debris out of a channel. If you had, you have a flood and the log comes in through your front door or through the side of your house, then yeah, but it wouldn't pay to clear the channel out or any sort of mitigation efforts. No. It would have to the policy covers the structure. We don't cover any sort of landscaping or debris on the property or pools, hot tubs, gazebos, things like that. If you had something that was damaged, try to quickly bring it inside the structure and before the claims adjuster gets there.
I've seen on policy something about toxic material that could be brought to my home down up from upstream. Would it cover the removal of that from my property? Like if I'm a foot deep in sewage?
A foot deep in sewage. So if you met the definition of a flood, so you had overland water from any source, and it had other particulates in it, you could file a claim and pay for the cleanup of that. Of the house, correct, not the land. And there may be other programs through CD8. I'm going to get the acronym wrong. Well, no, I was thinking through the state. Public health, yeah. I don't know if they have programs or not that could help pay for some of that, but that would not be covered under flood insurance. There may be other resources that would help with that. There may even be other federal agencies that could help with that. I guess I'm thinking EPA, but I'm not familiar with all of their programs, so, but I can say it would not pay through flood insurance. Yes, sir.
Can we assume that our regular insurance company is tied in with all of this information, federal, FEMA, whatever it is? Can we assume that they're gonna take care of us to the same degree that you're making it sound like we will be taken care of? For her $5,000?
I would never assume anything. Karen might have a better pulse on the local agents. I know we work very closely with the Rocky Mountain Insurance Institute on getting information out and doing trainings and webinars. We work closely with the State Insurance Commissioner's Office to get information out. We do a lot of trainings, typically at least once a year in the state. So I'm not exactly sure how things are down here. But Karen, do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, from what I'm understanding, and the reason why you guys were pretty much sent to, like, Lloyd's of London, is there's only 3 of us in Walsenburg licensed to sell flood. So if that agent is not licensed to sell flood, they have to send it out to someone like Lloyd's of London to have it done. So you need to ask your agent if they are specifically licensed to sell flood. They have to mark certificate.
Will they readily release that information, or will they tell us that she's
I would
policy?
think they'd be proud to let you know they have that. I mean, that was extra training, that's everything that we have to go through in order to get our license. It's an added license on top of my personal property and casualty. I'm proud of it. I want you to know I have that. You know what I mean? So I would think they would. So I bought an insurance policy, and I didn't know about what was local. I went through Geico. I don't know if now they're FEMA or private. You are more than welcome to bring any of your policies in and go over it with me, and we'll see what we can come up with, and I can tell you at least what questions to ask you. It was hard because I ended up with 5 very diverse quotes. Yeah. That covered different amounts. The FEMA quotes, they shouldn't, they should all be exactly the same.
Ma'am, in the back.
There are other licensed insurance agents in town. Walsenburg Insurance Center is one of them. And you have to consider whether you're being offered a quote through the FEMA program or through a private carrier. If people are licensed to do flood and insurance, they can do both. And depending on who your homeowner's carrier is, sometimes you can simply endorse flood coverage onto an existing homeowner's quote through that private carrier. But again, if you talk to your agent and explore those possibilities, they'll be able to go over with you what options are available in your particular circumstance.
Thank you very much. Yeah, like I said when we started, I just want people insured, and if it's through the NFIP, great. If it's through a Lloyd's of London or through something else like you're describing, where they tack on some type of rider with your policy, that's good, because the only time you need insurance is when you need to file a claim, and we want. Across the nation, we've done research and we've done studies. We are underinsured or uninsured, the majority of people, and we have a goal at FEMA to get people insured, to get more people insured. Yes, sir.
One of the questions that came up earlier was, will my insurance company help me out? And I think people need to truly understand that almost every insurance company that writes business in the United States excludes flood and earthquake. Okay? So if you have a flood event and you do not have this other insurance, be it FEMA, Lloyd's, or there's a half dozen other carriers that are good at
We celebrated our 50th birthday in 2018. Sorry, I didn't bring cake, but yes, that 250,000 has not been increased. There's been a lot of discussion about increasing it because it's so I do think that will change in the future at some point when Congress reauthorizes the program, but there are excess lines out there. There are markets. There's I know a lot of times a carrier will say, well, you have to get NFIP coverage first, the maximum, and then that will basically be the deductible for this excess line. Yes, sir.
So, on the coverage and payout, does this work sort of like my car? I just recently, unfortunately, had an event where my car was totaled, but the repair cost was nowhere near what the car's value was. But see where I'm going with this? How do we determine that there is the house is too damaged to do repairs and won't want to have it demolished? Who's in the decision-making process on that? And if the dollar amount is determined, what's that based on?
Did everyone hear that question? So how is the dollar amount determined during a claims, during an adjustment process? Who determines that? Is basically the gist of it. So in insurance, you can either have replacement cost or actual cash value. In order to actual cash value would be replacement cost minus depreciation. So, the carpeting that you got 10 years ago maybe was $5,000, but 10 years later it's not worth $5,000. You have to depreciate that, and that would be its actual cash value. In order to get replacement cost on a flood insurance policy, you have to be insured over 80. You have to be insured at least to 80% of the replacement cost value, or the maximum limit of $250,000. If you're not, it's going to be adjusted based on the actual cash value, and that's all happens through the claims process, through the adjuster and through the company. Contents is always on actual cash value, so it's always depreciated. I'm sorry?
Your television belongings are worth what you pay at the thrift store?
I'm not sure how the adjusters, they have kind of, I'm sure, standard, 42-inch flat screen TV is based on this.
So in the process of getting flood insurance, you're actually itemizing every single item?
Yeah, so if you have a claim, you will have to itemize, it's called a proof of loss, where basically you will sign a document saying this is all the damaged stuff. It's basically an agreement that you come to with the insurance company, with the adjuster, and you sign that proof of loss, and then a week later you have a check in your hand that you can cash and get started with the rebuilding process. Yeah, that's where I really encourage to start taking pictures and video of anything that you have that is worth value. Make sure that you have some sort of documentation showing that you actually do own that, and if you can assign a dollar amount to it, if you have a receipt, then that's all great stuff too. I don't know a lot of people that keep good track of their receipts.
How does that work? Like, my wood floors in my home are 130 years old. My house was built in 1888. Has it already depreciated? Is it a miracle I live in those
Yeah, as I mentioned before, I don't want to get too into the weeds on the claims process because there's some of the questions about depreciating wood floors that are 100 years old. I don't have the answers of how that adjustment would play out, so I don't want to give any false expectations of how that would work. I would say talk to your agent. Ask that specific question. How might this be adjusted? Is it damaged or can it be salvaged? Can you clean the floors and save that? Those would be questions for your agent. Yes, sir.
Through this program, is there a possibility of insurers, say, like a small horse barn? Or is it only on residential structure?
So again, another good question. He has a small horse barn. Typically, you can extend 10% of the policy to like a detached garage, but for most, you would have to have a separate policy for each individual structure. Certainly, I've seen someone that has a detached garage that is an amateur woodworker and has $25,000 worth of woodworking equipment and machines in their detached garage. That would be something I would encourage them to get a separate policy for. No, it would be, you'd get a separate policy through the National Flood Insurance Program. And one other thing I should mention is the policy does not cover vehicles. Stephanie mentioned that 24 inches of water can sweep an SUV off its wheels and down the river. That's not covered. Even if it's in your garage and you have a flooding event, vehicles are not covered under NFIP coverage. Any other hands or questions? Okay.
Question for Larry, if he's still. Larry, people have been asking me where we can pick up more sandbags. And I hear you're the man who knows.
So we had some discussions on that today. The process is not in place directly, so I don't know exactly when it will start, but Vicki, our land use manager, who works in the train depot, volunteered to take on the distribution of the rest of those sandbags. So the same rules would apply as were in place on Saturday. You'll need to bring your little pink registration card. If you don't have one of those, bring proof that you live in one of the flood zones. And they'll be handing out 200 bags per person. They got about another 15,000, so we'll see how that goes. That doesn't mean you won't necessarily be able to get more, but we got to try to ration them so that everybody gets some.
So that Saturday again is above the football field on that?
There, at this point in time, there's no additional Saturdays planned, no additional training, but the sand is there. You can go get the sand anytime you want, fill your bags. Yeah, it would be your presumably normal hours, but there may be a certain window. I don't know any of that. It would be at the depot, and this was just determined late this afternoon. So, give us a few days to sort that out because it's going to be kind of up to her and the county manager to decide. So, thank you all for coming.
Don't forget to take some handouts from the front. There's more information.